When the fire raged that night, my father made a choice. My sister lives, I burn. For decades, they called him a savior. But I'm here to tell you what really happened. Stay with me. And if you believe in justice, subscribe and tell me where. You're watching from... My dears, before the fire came, before my life was turned into ash and silence, we lived in a little wooden house on Sycamore Street. It wasn't much by the world's standards, but it was everything to us. Built in the 1940s, the beams creaked when you walked across them, and the narrow stairwell groaned each time we hurried up or down. The walls carried the scent of pine and old varnish, and on winter nights the wind slipped through the cracks, just enough to whistle in your ears while you slept. The house had 2 floors and an attic no one liked to enter because it smelled of dust and mothballs. Downstairs was the heart of our home. A kitchen with yellowing linoleum, a round oak table, and a stove that my mother kept burning from dawn to dusk in the cold months. We weren't rich, but she polished the floor until it shone and stitched curtains with her own hands so the place always felt warm and alive. Upstairs were 3 small bedrooms. My parents slept in one, my brother in another, and I shared with my younger sister, Rebecca. We weren't much alike. I was sturdy, taller than most girls my age, with hair that never stayed in its braid. Rebecca was pale and thin, often sick, coughing at night until my mother rushed to her side with a wet cloth. She had soft curls that people liked to touch, and big brown eyes that seemed too fragile for the world. Father noticed those things. He always noticed Rebecca. His name was Henry Cole, a man the whole town respected. He worked long hours at the factory and volunteered as a fire warden on weekends. People admired him for his strength, his deep voice, his ability to keep calm in any storm. To neighbors, he was a protector, a man who always stood tall. To me, he was a shadow I could never step out of. I was the middle child, the one he never feared losing. If I fell, he told me to get up. If I coughed, he said I'd be fine by morning. But if Rebecca sneezed once, he sat by her bed all night, eyes wide and restless. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was strong enough to carry my own weight. Still, a small ache grew in me every time I saw his hand rest on her forehead while mine went unnoticed. Our life had rhythm, simple and steady. Mornings began with the shrill whistle of his pocket watch alarm. Mother stirred eggs on the stove while Father buttoned his shirt with precise movements. My brother ran out the door first, always chasing the day, while Rebecca clung to her toast, like it might crumble in her hand. I cleaned the dishes, packed my books, and followed without complaint. Afternoons were my favorite. After school, I'd climb the oak tree in our yard, bark scratching my palms, the world small beneath my feet. From that height, I could see the rooftops of Sycamore Street, the smoke rising from chimneys, the narrow road that led to the square. I'd imagine a life bigger than ours, a life where being the strong one mattered, where no one called you the sturdy post, as if that were the only thing you'd ever be. Nights gathered us around the living room. The television hummed faintly, showing programs more static than picture. Father sat in his chair, reading the paper. Mother mended socks or embroidered in the lamplight. Rebecca leaned against him, thin legs curled like a cat, and I sat cross-legged, on the floor, pretending not to notice. Looking back, I see it clearly. Love in that house was uneven, measured like sugar in a jar. My mother tried to spread it equally, pouring herself into each of us. But my father held back his affection, saving it for the daughter he believed needed him most. That imbalance, my dears, was the spark waiting for fire. A fire that would not only burn our home to the ground, but carve a scar across my life, so deep I would carry it into old age. If you are still listening, remember this. Sometimes tragedy doesn't begin with flames or smoke. Sometimes it begins with silence, with a father's glance that lingers too long on one child while passing over another. That was the house on Sycamore Street. That was where my story began. My dears, when I look back on those years, I see my father not only as the man inside our home, but also as the man everyone else thought he was. To the town, Henry Cole was a pillar, dependable, steady, the kind of man whose handshake felt like a promise. To me, he was a shadow, tall and unshakable, but always standing between me and the light. He worked 6 days a week at the iron factory. The air there was thick with smoke and sparks, but he carried that grit home like a badge. His shirts smelled faintly of ash and metal, and neighbors would often remark, "There goes Henry, hardest worker this town has." On Sundays, he wore his pressed suit to church, standing straight in the pew, leading hymns with his deep baritone voice. People admired him not only for his work ethic, but also for the way he volunteered as a fire warden. Irony, isn't it? The man who later would be remembered for dying in a fire spent years warning others how to stay safe from it. Our pastor often said, "God gives some men strength to carry others." When he said it, eyes would drift toward my father. He would bow his head humbly, but inside our home, that strength wasn't carried equally. Rebecca was the fragile one. Pale skin, frequent fevers, a cough that rattled her chest like an old door hinge. My mother hovered over her with teas, medicines, and whispered prayers. Father joined her vigil each time Rebecca's health dipped. He'd pace the room, restless, jaw tight, as if the world might collapse if she stopped breathing for even a moment. But when I got sick, when a flu knocked me to the mattress with sweat and chills, he'd open the window for air, mutter, "You'll fight it off," and leave for work. Not cruel words, not unkind, but distant, detached, as though my strength made me unworthy of his concern. I tried not to care. I told myself I didn't need his attention. After all, my brother Mark and I were built of sturdier stuff. But children always notice who a father lingers on, whose laughter makes him smile, whose tears make him bend down in alarm. At family dinners, he sat with Rebecca pressed to his side, cutting her meat into smaller bites as if she were too delicate for the task. When I asked him questions about school, his replies were short, distracted, his eyes always darting back to her. Even my brother, who he treated as an heir, got more of his attention than I ever did. There was one evening, years before the fire, that seared itself into my memory. A storm rattled the windows, thunder rumbling across Sycamore Street. The lights flickered, and Rebecca whimpered. Father scooped her into his lap, whispering, "Don't be afraid. Daddy's here." I sat on the rug near his feet, clutching my knees, hoping for the same comfort. Instead, he glanced down at me and said, "You're strong. You don't need me the way she does." At the time, I swallowed the words like medicine, bitter but unchallenged. It wasn't until much later that I realized what he meant. To him, I was expendable, useful perhaps, but not precious. Outside our home, the story was very different. In town meetings, neighbors praised his composure. During fire drills at school, other children whispered with awe, "Your dad is the one who checks all the alarms, right?" They thought I was lucky to have him. But luck, my dears, is not the same as love. That duality, admired by all, but partial at home, was the root of everything that came later. People believed he was fair, brave, the very definition of a protector. They never saw the way his eyes weighed us differently, calculating, always tipping toward Rebecca. I sometimes wonder if tragedy doesn't start in the moment of disaster, but years earlier, in quiet choices and uneven affections. In my father's shadow, I grew strong, yes, but also invisible. And when the night came that our house filled with smoke, his shadow stretched even further, covering me completely. My dears, it was a January night in 1974 when everything changed. The kind of night where the air cut sharp against your skin and the furnace rattled like an old man coughing in the basement. Outside, snow piled against the porch steps. Inside, our little wooden house on Sycamore Street groaned under the weight of the storm. I went to bed that night thinking about nothing more than the spelling test I had the next morning. Rebecca was already asleep beside me, her breath shallow but steady, her small hand curled into a fist on the blanket. Mother kissed our foreheads before heading downstairs. Father stayed up late in his chair, pipe in hand, eyes drifting between the newspaper and the flickering television. At first, the smell was faint, like burnt toast. I stirred, half asleep, until I heard a crack that didn't belong. Not thunder, not the house shifting in the cold. A crack that splintered through the silence. When I opened my eyes, the room was hazy. Smoke curled against the ceiling, dark and restless. My throat tightened, my eyes watered, and Rebecca coughed violently beside me. "Daddy!" I shouted. My voice broke against the smoke. In seconds, the hallway filled with footsteps. Father burst in, his face already streaked with ash. He didn't panic, not Henry Cole. His voice was firm, commanding, like the fire drills he'd led for years. "Dorothy, get Mark!" he barked to my mother, who appeared pale and trembling at the doorway. He turned to me. "Grab your sister, now!" The heat swelled quickly, rising from below. Flames had caught in the living room, devouring the old curtains and creeping up the walls like hungry hands. I lifted Rebecca, coughing into her hair, and stumbled toward the stairs. Father moved with precision, pushing furniture aside, clearing a path as though every move had already been rehearsed. The air roared with fire, a beast alive in our home. Windows shattered from the heat, the sound sharp as gunshots. "Stay low," he ordered, shoving us toward the ground. We crawled, the floor warm beneath our palms. My heart hammered in my chest, every breath a fight against the smoke. At the stairwell, Father paused, blocking me with his arm. The fire below spat sparks upward, turning the narrow passage into a chimney of flame. "We'll make it through," he muttered, mostly to himself. His eyes darted to Rebecca in my arms, her lips turning pale, her small chest rising in ragged gasps. It was in that moment, even before the final choice, that I felt the weight of his calculation. His gaze wasn't on me, it was on her, always her. Mother screamed from the bottom of the stairs, "Henry, hurry!" My brother's voice followed, panicked, calling our names. Father yanked a blanket from the banister, wrapped it around Rebecca, and barked at me. "Hand her over!" His hands shook, not from fear of the flames, but from fear of losing her. I hesitated only a second, but his glare left no room for disobedience. I passed her into his arms, and for a heartbeat, relief softened his face. That was the first spark, of betrayal. Not the fire climbing the walls, but the knowledge that if choices had to be made, I would not be the one he carried. We pushed forward, smoke choking us, flames licking the stairwell. The air burned my lungs raw. Father shouted for Mark to open the front door wide, to clear the way. He pressed Rebecca against his chest, shielding her tiny body as he descended step by step into the fiery glow. I followed, my legs trembling, my skin prickling with heat. Halfway down, a beam cracked above us and fell, crashing between us and the front door. Sparks rained down, searing my nightdress. I screamed, clawing at my arms. Father didn't even turn. His whole body curved around Rebecca, his voice steady as he ordered my brother to clear the debris. That was when I knew. I could scream, burn, collapse in those flames, and he would not look back. The fire roared louder, the smoke thickened, and the house that had cradled our childhood became a trap. Every second was a battle. And yet, my dears, the worst battle wasn't with the fire at all. It was with the truth that had finally burned clear. I was never the one he intended to save. My dears, people often imagine betrayal as a knife in the back, a sudden act you never see coming. But the greatest betrayal of my life was one I saw, with my own eyes, in the bright glare of a burning house. We reached the bottom of the stairs, smoke curling around us like black ropes. The fire had already eaten through the living room walls. Flames danced along the curtains, clawed at the ceiling, and snapped at our ankles as if determined to drag us down. Father was first, Rebecca wrapped tight in the blanket against his chest. Behind him, my brother Mark stumbled with an armful of papers and family photographs, foolishly trying to save what could not be saved. Mother hovered in the doorway, her face streaked with soot, her hands trembling. She screamed over the roar, "Henry, hurry! The roof won't hold!" I coughed, my throat raw, vision swimming. The heat pressed against my skin like an iron. But I followed, trusting that if I stayed close, we'd all escape together. Then the beam fell. It came from above with a deafening crack, splitting the path to the front door. Sparks flew, burning holes into the carpet, scattering across our clothes. For a moment, all of us froze, coughing in the smoke, trapped in the living room while the fire tightened its grip. "Out the back!" Mark shouted, pointing toward the kitchen. But the doorway was already collapsing, swallowed by flames. The only way was forward, through the door now blocked by the smoldering beam. Father didn't hesitate. He shifted Rebecca higher in his arms and barked at Mark, "Move that wood!" Mark strained against the beam, his hands burning as he tried to lift it. The smoke was too thick, the fire too wild. He couldn't budge it, and that's when Father's eyes met mine. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. No roar, no screams, just the weight of his gaze on me. He looked at Rebecca, then back at me, coughing, trembling, reaching for him like a child begging for help. "Hand her to me," Mother cried from behind. But Father didn't hear her. Or maybe he chose not to. He grabbed my wrist with his free hand. His grip was iron, digging into my skin. For a moment, I thought he was pulling me toward safety. Relief surged in me, like cool air after suffocation. But then he pushed. Hard. I stumbled backward into the choking haze, the fire licking closer. My shoulder slammed against the wall, my lungs screamed for air. Through the blur, I heard his voice, low but sharp, words that carved deeper than the flames ever could. "Your sister needs me more." That was it. No explanation, no apology. Just a verdict, handed down like a judge's gavel. He turned away, clutching Rebecca tighter, and pushed toward the blocked doorway. Mark was still struggling with the beam, shouting for help. Mother screamed my name, her voice breaking into sobs. But Father didn't look back. Not once. I tried to crawl, the floor scorching beneath my hands, my chest heavy with smoke. The world tilted, my vision narrowed. I reached out, desperate, but the distance grew wider with every second. The last thing I saw was Father's broad back disappearing into the glow, Rebecca's pale face pressed against his shirt. The door burst open as neighbors outside pulled them through. Light poured in, air, hope, everything just beyond my reach. And then the flames surged, the roof groaned, and the house that had been my childhood came crashing down on top of me. People say I was lucky that night. Lucky that the neighbors pulled me from the wreckage before the fire consumed me whole. But tell me, my dears, what is luck when the person meant to protect you chooses otherwise? That was the night my father died, a hero in everyone's eyes. But in mine, he lived long enough to let me burn. My dears, I don't remember the moment they pulled me from the wreckage. I'm told it was Mr. Alvarez from across the street and his son, Daniel, two silhouettes against a wall of orange, hacking their way through smoke with wet rags over their mouths. They say my hand was sticking out from under a fallen joist, palm burned, fingers curled like a blackened leaf. They followed the small sound I was making, something between a cough and a prayer, and dragged me into the snow. Cold. That's my first clear memory, the pure, shocking cold. The night air bit every inch of me, and then there were voices, too many, shouting, counting, pleading. Someone pressed a coat around my shoulders. Someone else kept telling me to stay awake. Breathe, sweetheart. Slow, a woman said, and a mask descended over my face, tasting like plastic and rain. The siren's cry folded me into darkness, and when I woke again it was morning, and the ceiling was white. A nurse with kind eyes dabbed ointment on my wrists and spoke in the voice people use for broken things. "You're safe now," she said. "You're at St. Agnes." I tried to ask about my family, but my throat scraped like sand. She lifted a cup with a straw to my lips. Water hurt and healed me in the same swallow. By afternoon, Mother appeared at my bedside, wrapped in a blanket that wasn't ours. Her face looked older by 10 winters. She kissed my forehead, then pressed my fingers to her lips as if I were made of glass. Behind her stood Mark, bruised and smoky, clutching a brown paper bag with a scarf in it, my favorite. He put it in my lap like a medal he wished he could deserve. I searched the doorway for Father and Rebecca. "Rebecca's sleeping," Mother whispered, answering the question I hadn't managed to ask. "She had smoke in her lungs, but the doctor says she'll be all right." Her voice thinned on the last word, like a thread pulled too tight. "Your father?" She stopped. A sound came out of her chest, soft and terrible. "He didn't make it, baby." There was a long, slow silence in me, like snow falling in an empty field. I nodded. I didn't say what I remembered. I didn't say the words he'd left in my ear like a brand. "Your sister needs me more." Instead, I pulled the scarf to my chin and shut my eyes as if I could make the truth dim by dimming. The room? The hospital filled with flowers that week. Baskets and wreaths with small cards from the church, the firehouse, the factory. People sent prayers and stories. "Your father was a brave man. Your father saved a family 2 streets over." Last summer. Your father taught our boy how to use a fire extinguisher. The words stacked like bricks around my bed, building a wall I couldn't climb. On the third day, a reporter came, all tender smiles and fast questions. The pastor stood beside him, hands folded, eyes a little too bright. The fire chief held, his hat against his chest, and told the room, Henry Cole gave his life getting his girls out. Gave his life. He said it twice, like a refrain. A camera flash popped. The nurse adjusted my blanket. Mark squeezed my shoulder. I felt the inside of my mouth go dry as paper. I opened my lips. The room seemed to lean toward me. For a moment, I thought I might speak. Tell them how the smoke had wrapped the stairwell, how the beam had fallen, how my father's hand had gripped my wrist and then pushed, how the sentence had landed, small, quiet, final. My mother's fingers found mine under the blanket and squeezed. Not hard, not warning exactly. Just a plea from a woman who had lost her home and her husband in one night and could not afford to lose the only story that let her stand upright. Rest, sweetheart, she murmured. You don't have to say anything. So I didn't. The walls of the story rose higher. By the time I was discharged, the town had chosen the headline. Brave father dies saving children. The newspaper ran a photo of him in his volunteer jacket, smiling the smile he wore for other people. Someone started a collection at the factory. The firehouse proposed a plaque for the front hall. Men I barely knew patted my head and told me to be proud. Women pressed baked goods into our arms, sweet and heavy and impossible to swallow. At home, what was left of home, we slept on cots in the church basement. Rebecca wheezed softly on the bed beside mine. When she woke, her eyes flitted around like a bird in a room with no doors. She whispered, "Dad?" and then winced, as though the word itself hurt. I told her to rest. I smoothed her hair. I said the kindest lie I knew. He was brave. In the thin hours of those nights, I learned how quiet grows teeth. My burns itched under their dressings. My lungs seized when the furnace clicked on. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the doorway ahead of me flash gold and white, and the space between us growing wider. I pressed my palms into the rough church blanket until the sting of my skin replaced the fire in my head. A social worker came, soft-voiced, practical. In hard times, she said, people need a story to hold. She was kind. She meant it as comfort. But I heard the rest of the sentence. Even if that story isn't true. I nodded and thanked her, and when she left, I pressed my forehead to the cool window and watched snowfall bury the steps. In the weeks that followed, the town rebuilt us with casseroles and condolences, with a fundraiser in the school gym, with a promise. Your father will be honored properly. I tried to be grateful. I tried not to choke on the word honored. I learned how to smile without opening my teeth. If you're still with me, listen closely. The fire scarred my skin, but the praise scarred my voice. Every time someone called him a savior, the part of me that remembered grew smaller and smaller, like a candle flicker at the end of the wick. They said the plaque would go up in spring, a brass rectangle in the front hall of the firehouse with a line engraved beneath his name. He gave all. I traced that sentence in my mind until it bent, until it broke, until it pointed me toward a question I didn't yet know how to ask out loud. Because what came next, my dears, burned worse than the flames. The day the lie was nailed to the wall. Stay with me. In the next part, I'll tell you how a town can bury a truth, even while looking a survivor in the eye. My dears, spring came early that year, the kind that tricks crocuses into showing their faces before the frost is finished with them. By then, I was back at school, moving through hallways like a shadow in a borrowed coat. People stepped aside, touched my arm, whispered the same 4 words as if they were a prayer and an answer both. Your father was brave. The newspaper made it official. A front-page photo of Henry Cole in his volunteer jacket, jaw set, eyes steady. The headline read, "He gave all." Inside, a full column told how he carried his daughters through smoke and turned back into the flames. I stared at that sentence until it blurred. I could feel the heat again, the hand on my wrist, the hard push, the words that would not print. Your sister needs me more. At church, the pastor preached about sacrifice. Everyone nodded at the right moments. A woman pressed a casserole into Mother's hands and said, God picks his strongest for the hardest trials. Mother smiled the tired smile she wore for public places and squeezed my knuckles until her nails left moons in my skin. I understood. Not here. Not today. The plaque came in April. Brass, heavy, polished so bright you could see your face bent in it. They set it in the firehouse foyer, between 2 framed photos of parades. The whole town gathered. Men in dress hats stood straight as fence posts. Women dabbed their eyes with folded tissues. Mark wore father's tie, the knot choking him red. Rebecca, still thin and skittish from winter, clung to mother's sleeve like a child in a crowd. I stood a little behind them, where the smell of metal polish and coffee didn't reach so strong. The fire chief spoke first. Henry Cole taught us what duty looks like. The mayor followed, reading from a paper he'd practiced. When smoke filled his home, Henry ensured his family's safety and paid the ultimate price. Words polished like the plaque. Not a nick. Not a dent. Would you like to say something? The pastor whispered to Mother. Mother's lips parted, then closed. She shook her head. Thank you, she said softly, and stared at the floor, eyes turned to me, the surviving daughter, the one with bandaged wrists and a voice everyone hoped would bless the story. I felt 100 small kindnesses pressing me toward the microphone, and in the same moment, every memory in my body pulled me back. I could have walked those 6 steps. I could have said, I was there. I know what happened. Instead, I took a breath that hurt and said nothing. After, people lined up to touch the brass with their fingertips, as if courage could rub off. I watched Mark do it, jaw set, eyes hot. He didn't look at me. Later, by the coffee urn, he finally spoke. It helps them, he said, not quite meeting my gaze. It helps, Mom. Don't take it away. I didn't put it there, I answered. He flinched like I'd struck him, and we both fell quiet. At school, they held safety day in Father's name. The principal gathered us in the gym and told us how to crawl low, cover our mouths, check the doorknob for heat. He said my father had done all the right things. Children clapped because adults were watching. A guidance counselor sat me down afterward, hands folded like a small church. Stories help us heal, she said. Sometimes the cleanest version is what a town needs. I nodded because I had learned that nodding was safer than the truth. I tried once, just once, to set a corner straight. I took a bus across town and found the reporter who had written the article. He lived in a small apartment that smelled like paper and onions. I told him I remembered the push, the words, the door opening like a mouth I couldn't reach. He listened, pen hovering, then set it down. "You were a child in a fire," he said gently. "Memory plays tricks, and the chief confirmed your father's actions. He offered tea I didn't drink, and a card I didn't keep." On my way back, I stopped at Mr. Alvarez's porch. He and Daniel had pulled me from the wreck. We sat on the steps, the wood warm from the sun. "You saved me," I said. He nodded, eyes far off. "We did what we could. Your father." He searched for a sentence he could live with. "He was carrying your sister. It was chaos." Daniel stared at his shoes. "We saw a lot," he muttered. "I'm glad you're here." That was all. The town moved forward, as towns must. The factory whistle blew on time. Lawns greened. The hole on Sycamore Street filled with gravel and then with grass. People crossed the firehouse foyer without slowing, the plaque now a part of the wall like it had always been there. The sentence beneath his name caught the light and threw it back at anyone who looked. He gave all. At night, in the small bedroom of the rented duplex where we lived while insurance decided who we were, I started a shoebox. I lined it with an old scarf and slid in what I could claim. The program from the plaque ceremony. The newspaper with the headline. One crumpled photo where my father's hand hovers over Rebecca's shoulder and not mine. The hospital band they cut from my wrist. Not proof, not yet, just fragments. A map I would learn to read later. People say time heals. I think time teaches silence its manners. I learned which rooms could hold the truth and which could not. I learned how to fold my face so nothing spilled out. I learned that a lie nailed to a wall is harder to pry loose than a board on a burning house. If you're still here with me, know this. The day they hung that plaque, the town decided who my father had been. The next day, I began to decide who I would have to become to live with it. And that, my dears, is how a myth grows. Watered by grief, polished by praise, guarded by good intentions. Chapter by chapter, it buried my voice until only a whisper remained. In the years that followed, I would take that whisper and turn it into a life. But first, I had to learn how to be the girl who survived and wasn't believed. My dears, there is a way a town looks at you when it has already decided what your story is. Heads tilt, voices soften, hands hover, as if you might crack from the weight of a question. They called me the brave man's daughter and, in the same breath, watched my mouth to make sure I didn't say anything that might chip the plaque on the firehouse wall. High school carried on like a train that refused to notice the wreck beside the tracks. Teachers gave me extra time on essays and then assigned Heroes Among Us for Assembly Week. In hallways, I heard whispers open and close like locker doors. Poor thing. She should be proud. When I tried to speak plain, only once, about the last thing I heard in that burning room, a girl flinched as if I'd coughed smoke in her face. A boy shook his head slowly and said, "You were scared. People remember wrong when they're scared." I learned the lesson. Pity comes with rules. Break one, and it turns into doubt. Night was worse. I woke to the sound of nothing and still tasted ash. I kept a pitcher of water by the bed and a damp cloth under my pillow like a secret spell. The furnace thump sent me upright. The smell of burnt toast could bring tears, and I would stand at the sink, window unlocked, coat within reach, telling myself there were 2 doors and a window, and I could fit through each if the world caught fire again. At church, they lit candles for Advent, and I stood at the back with my coat on, counting exits. Anger lived in me like a pilot light, small, steady, ready. Not wild rage, that would have been easier to name. Mine was quieter, the anger of being the child who didn't get chosen, of hearing a town say the word sacrifice like a hymn while my own memory sat alone in the last pew. When Mark said, "It helps them," I nodded. But inside, I wanted to ask why my truth was the one thing not allowed to help me. I kept the shoebox. New fragments went in. A program from Safety Day with my father's name in bold. A church bulletin asking for donations to the plaque fund. A Polaroid of me and Rebecca at the school carnival where the bonfire made her smile and sent me to the farthest edge of the field. I wrote dates on the back of things in careful pencil, as if a future version of me might need to prove I had lived through all this. The day I left did not announce itself as a decision. It began like any other. Mother stirring oatmeal, Rebecca worrying the spoon, Mark already halfway out the door with his jaw set. A brochure from the community college lay under the salt. "They've got a work-study program," Mother said. Hope carefully folded into her voice. I looked at the paper and felt a door close inside me. The town, the plaque, the careful nodding. If I stayed, I would learn to be the girl who never contradicted a wall. So I packed a small bag in the shoebox and waited until the house was quiet. Mother found me at the door like she always did, knowing the shape of my leaving before I knew it myself. "You coming back?" she asked. There was no anger in her voice, only the tired love of a woman who had used up too many kinds of bravery. "I don't know," I said. "I just need to breathe." She pressed a bill into my palm, worn and folded. "Then breathe," she whispered and kissed my forehead. "Call when you can." I took the bus west because it was the first one leaving. The station smelled like wet newspapers and coffee, and I sat with my shoebox on my lap like a child with a treasure no one else would want. The town disappeared behind winter trees, and then there were new roofs, new church steeples, new corners where my father's name did not live. In a city that wasn't ours, Madison, I found a room above a bakery. I paid extra for the one with 2 windows and a fire escape. The bakery was a poor choice for a girl who hated heat, but the landlord was kind, and the smell at dawn was more sugar than smoke. I took a job shelving books at a second-hand store where the owner didn't ask for much beyond honesty and a steady, "Name for the paperwork?" he asked, pen hovering. The truth felt too thin to protect me here. The old lie felt too heavy to carry. I looked at a spine on the counter, Ward's almanac, and heard myself say, "Elena Ward." The pen moved. Just like that, I became someone I could walk around in without every glance catching on the word hero. I did not become happy. That is not how reinvention works. I became quiet in a different place. I learned the streets and the bus routes and the times of day when the sun warmed my windows without making the room feel like a threat. I kept matches out of drawers. I folded my coat over the chair each night like a promise. At the bookstore, I hid in the alphabet, Austin to Baldwin, Cather to Diaz, finding lives that did not have to be argued with a plaque. Guilt traveled with me, light enough to carry everywhere, heavy enough to bruise. When I counted the money, at month's end, I thought of Mother's hands, of Rebecca's thin wrists. I wrote letters I did not send. I walked to the post office, stood in line, and left with the envelope still sealed in my pocket. The first spring in the new city, I saw a fire truck idling at a curb and crossed the street without deciding to. The driver waved a friendly hand, and I waved back, my throat tight, the past pulling and letting go like a tide. People at work knew me as the girl who was early and left the light on in the back room. A neighbor knew me as the one who watered her geraniums when she visited her sister. To the boy at the corner deli, I was Miss Ward, rye and apples. No one knew I slept with the window cracked year-round to hear the night. No one knew about the shoebox on the highest shelf of the closet, the one I stood on a chair to reach when the world tilted, and I needed to touch proof that I wasn't making myself up. Leaving didn't free me from the story. It gave me space to stand beside it without being swallowed. In that space, small and rented and mine, I began to practice a new kind of breath. Not the kind you gulp when you are running from flames, but the kind you take when you are learning how to live after them. If you're still with me, remember, a ghost is only a person who hasn't been believed yet. In the years ahead, I would learn how to speak so even the wind paused to listen. But first, I had to be Elena for a while. So, Olivia could survive. My dears, the invitation came folded inside a fundraiser flyer, the kind printed on glossy paper that smells faintly of ink and certainty. Help us raise the Henry Cole statue, it said, the statue to be placed at the rebuilt fire station where the plaque already hung. I held the paper over my sink in the city where I had become Elena Ward and felt the old house on Sycamore Street stand up inside me like a ghost. I took the early bus home. The town had grown a new skin, fresh storefronts, repaved streets, trees, taller than my memory. But some things hadn't moved at all. The church bell still rang on the hour. The factory whistle still split noon. And there at the corner where our house used to be, the ground was polite and empty. Grass had covered the scar years ago. Only the old mailbox stump remained, half rotten, leaning as if it were tired of holding its place. I stood with my hand on it and said our names under my breath, Mother, Mark, Rebecca, and the one I said last. At the cemetery, a small flag snapped in the wind by my father's stone. Henry Cole, beloved husband, father, hero. Someone had tucked a program from the Hawan annual memorial behind the vase. I slid it free. Mark's name was listed as a speaker. Rebecca's name was not. I walked to the firehouse next. New brick, big bay doors, a clean foyer where the brass plaque shone like a sun that never set. Visitors had left fingerprints on the corners. You could see the smudges if you leaned close. I didn't touch it. I read the line I'd read 1,000 times. He gave all. A young firefighter glanced up from the desk and smiled. You here for the statue meeting tonight? He asked. I nodded before my mouth found a sentence. I had not come to make a scene. I had come to listen, to see if the story they were building could bear even a breath of mine. In the library, the woman at the reference desk still knew my mother's middle name. Microfilm machine's temperamental, she warned, rolling out a cart of binders. I fed old newspapers into the machine and watched the years rattle by in black and white. The first article I knew by heart, but the next week's paper surprised me. A small correction buried under the classifieds. Origin of fire revised from furnace to living room space heater. Investigation ongoing. I remembered no space heater. We never owned one. I wrote the date on an index card and put it in my pocket. I found the insurance report at the county building, a copy in a tan folder with a rusty clip. The adjuster had underlined a line about blocked egress at the front door and handwritten, Beam down before first rescue. Before. I sat with the folder open and felt my breath go shallow the way it does on stairs. If the beam fell first, then the path was already blocked when he pushed me back. I walked Sycamore Street at dusk and knocked on 2 doors where I remembered names. Mr. Alvarez had moved years ago, but his son, Daniel, lived 3 blocks over, with a porch that sagged under flower pots. He knew me at once, though not by the name on my mailbox back in the city. We sat on his steps, his knees cracked like old wood. "They want to put him up in bronze now?" he asked. I nodded. He rubbed his jaw. "I remember pulling you out," he said. "I remember your hand." He looked away for a long time. "The fire chief told us later how your dad went back for pictures." He winced as if the sentence scalded. "Maybe I'm remembering it wrong." Memory is not a photograph, my dears. It's a field in wind. But sometimes the grass leans the same way in more than one place. At the church office, the secretary let me read a box of old bulletins. One line from the pastor's eulogy caught me by the throat. Henry gathered treasured family papers before the smoke overcame him. Papers, not a child. Cracks, yes. Proof, no. When I tested the edges with careful questions, people grew gentle and firm. "He saved you girls," the clerk at the bakery said, sliding a bag across the counter. "Why revisit pain?" the librarian asked, kindness covering steel. The new fire chief, a man too young to remember the night, tapped the plaque with his knuckle and said, "This is our history," as if brass could not lie. I left the library near closing and walked past the meeting notice taped to the firehouse window. Public hearing, statue design selection, Thursday, 7 p.m. I stood at the glass and saw my face doubled, the woman I had, become overlaid on the girl who had crawled toward a door that opened without her. I went back to my room over the diner and emptied my bag onto the bed. The microfilm printouts, the index card with the correction, the insurance line about the fallen beam, the eulogy phrase, treasured family papers. I laid them side by side like kindling, small sticks that might one day make a fire of their own. The right kind, the kind that gives light. No one believed me yet. Maybe no one ever would. But for the first time in years, I felt the story loosen, a little in my chest, as if the truth had found the seam and was working quietly at the thread. Tomorrow would be Thursday. The room where they chose statues had good lighting and comfortable chairs. I planned to sit in the back, the way ghosts. And when they asked for public comment, I planned, not to haunt, but to speak. My dears, the night before the statue meeting, I dialed a number my hands remembered better than my courage. Mark answered on the second ring. His voice carried the same iron I'd grown up with. I told him I was in town. I told him I needed to see him and Rebecca together. He hesitated long enough for me to hear the old factory whistle in the silence between us. "Tomorrow morning," he said at last. "My kitchen." The house he lived in wasn't ours, but it had the same plain table, the same chipped mugs, the same way light fell across a floor as if it were looking for someone. Rebecca sat already, slim as a pencil, sleeves pulled over her hands. She did not rise when I came in. She just lifted her eyes and searched my face for the girl she remembered. Mark poured coffee and didn't ask if I took sugar. "I heard you're speaking at the hearing," he said, by way of beginning. "I'm speaking to you first," I answered. He nodded, jaw tight. Rebecca's gaze dropped to the table. I saw your name in the library sign-in, she whispered. Elena Ward. The name sat between us like a stranger I had brought along. You always liked the window seat, she added, as if to prove I was still mine. We let the cups warm our hands a moment. I pulled a thin folder from my bag and set it on the table. Before I tell you what happened, I said, I need you to know I didn't come to ruin anybody's memory. I came because the story we've been living in doesn't fit. It never did. Rebecca's fingers tightened in her sleeves. I always thought, maybe it was me, she said, voice small as thread, that if I hadn't been so fragile, if I hadn't coughed so much, she swallowed. He chose me, didn't he? The last two words broke like ice. Mark pushed back his chair. Becca, he warned, the old defense rising to its post. We don't know what a man does in smoke. I do, I said quietly. I was there. He looked at me then, really looked. The kitchen clock ticked loud enough to count a life. Bye, I told them. Not the cleaned-up story. Not the version that fits easily in a eulogy. I told them the way it lives in my lungs. The beam dropping, the door blocked, the blanket wrapped around Rebecca, the feel of his fingers on my wrist, the pull I thought was rescue, the sudden hard push that sent me back into heat and dark. And then the sentence that never let me sleep right again. Your sister needs me more. Rebecca made a sound I had never heard from her before, a keening that belonged to animals and old women. She covered her mouth with both hands. Mark shook his head once, twice. No, he said, but the word didn't land anywhere. He went back for you. He had to. His eyes begged the room to agree. I slid the folder toward him. The newspaper correction, I said, tapping the top page. They changed the origin of the fire a week later. No furnace, no space heater. We never owned one. The next page. The insurance note. Beam down before first rescue. If the beam fell first, the front door wasn't open yet. The last sheet. From the pastor's own eulogy. Treasured family papers. Mark didn't touch the papers. He read from a distance. The way people read headstones they aren't ready to stand over. Wording, he said, but softer now. Pastors say things. They do, I agreed. So do fathers. Rebecca's shoulders shook. I always felt like I took up all the air in a room, she whispered. Like love had to be rationed and I was the reason. She looked at me, eyes naked. Every time someone called him a hero, I thought, he loved me more than he loved you. I didn't know what to do with that. You weren't the reason, I said, and the truth came out of me like breath after a long dive. You were the excuse he told himself. That's different. Mark sat down again as if his legs had remembered something his mind hadn't. He picked up the eulogy printout at last and traced the line with his thumb. Papers, he murmured. He always told me to guard the papers first. Birth certificates. Policies. He blinked hard. I thought that was responsibility. I didn't think... The sentence died and left him alone with it. No one spoke. The clock counted us forward. Outside, a truck downshifted at the corner. Somewhere a dog complained. At a mailman. We let the ordinary world do what it does while our small one tipped and settled. I don't want to hate him, Mark said finally, voice hoarse. He worked himself to bone for us. I don't hate him, I answered. I hate the lie. That made me disappear. Rebecca reached for me across the table. We had not held hands since we were girls sharing a pillow. Her fingers were cold. "I'm sorry," she said, as if apology could travel backward through time and change a man's grip. "I'm sorry for all the years you were alone with it. I couldn't let myself wonder." "You were surviving the story you were given," I said. "So was I." Mark let out a breath that seemed to shake the light over the table. "If we say this out loud," he said, "it will break things." "It will mend others," I said. "Maybe not neatly, maybe not soon, but it will let us stand in the same room without that wall between us." He nodded once, a small surrender, and put his palm flat on the folder like a man swearing a quiet oath. "I'll read everything," he said. "Twice." He looked at me then. "If you speak tonight, I'll stand there. I don't know if I can talk yet, but I can stand." Rebecca wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand and tried for a smile that trembled at the edges. "I'll come too," she said. "Not because I'm brave, but because I'm tired of being the reason no one asks the right question." We sat a while longer with the coffee growing cold, three people who had been children in a fire learning how to be a family in its aftermath. When I rose to leave, Rebecca held on a heartbeat longer than the hug required. Mark opened the door, and for the first time in my life, he didn't try to decide the next thing for me. He just said, "I'll be there. If you're still with me, remember, acceptance is not a switch, it's a hinge." That morning, ours finally turned, and when evening came, we walked toward the room where a town keeps its history, ready, at last, to open it. My dears, when the night of the hearing finally arrived, I felt the weight of 40 years pressing against my ribs. The firehouse meeting room smelled of fresh paint and old coffee, a blend of the present and the past. Folding chairs squeaked as neighbors and city officials found their places. At the front stood 3 poster boards showing different designs of the statue they planned for my father, each one taller than life, each one holding a plaque that would brand him forever as a hero. I sat in the back row. Mark was on my left, shoulders tense, eyes locked forward. Rebecca was on my right, her sleeves tugged down over her hands like a child hiding in plain sight. We had spoken our truths in a kitchen not 24 hours before, and now we were here, bound together by the same secret, ready to see if the world could bear it. The chairwoman of the committee stood and began the meeting with cheerful formality. She thanked donors, praised the fire department, and spoke about honoring sacrifice. Then she invited public comment. A clipboard made its way down the rows. My name was already written there, Olivia Cole. Not Elena Ward, not Helen. Olivia. When they called me forward, the room turned as one body. I felt the stares prick my skin, but I kept my head high. My hands trembled, so I pressed them flat on the podium. "My name is Olivia Cole," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "You've read that name on plaques and in old newspapers. Most of you believe I died the night of the fire, but I didn't. I lived. And tonight, I need to tell you why the story you've carried for 40 years isn't the whole truth." The room went still. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum quieter. I told them what happened, how the beam fell, how the door was blocked, how my father wrapped Rebecca in a blanket and pressed her toward safety. But when it was my turn, his hand tightened around my wrist and then pushed me back. And then I gave them the words that had haunted every dream since. "Your sister needs me more." A gasp cut through the silence. Some shook their heads, others just stared. I held up the folder of evidence, yellowed newspaper corrections, The insurance report noting beam down before first rescue, the pastor's eulogy line about treasured family papers. These don't prove intent, I admitted. But they show a pattern of a man who put things and appearances above lives. My life. And I'm asking this committee not to carve his name into bronze and call it truth. The chairwoman looked pale. A man in the second row rose slowly. Daniel Alvarez, son of the neighbor who had pulled me from the wreckage. I remember that night, he said, voice rough. We dragged her out. Not Henry. Her. If she says this is the truth, I believe her. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some shook their heads in denial. Others nodded, eyes wet. The pastor himself, now older and bent, spoke up from the back. I preached his eulogy, he admitted. I wrote what comforted the living. But comfort is not the same as truth. Rebecca rose then, her whole body trembling. He favored me my whole life, she confessed, her voice breaking. And I lived believing that made me special. But it made me carry guilt instead. My sister is alive. And she is telling the truth. Mark stood too, slowly, as if his boots were heavy with 40 years of silence. He didn't speak long, just one sentence. I saw the papers before the fire, he said, voice shaking. He told me to guard them first, not the family, the papers. I wanted to believe he was a hero. But heroes don't make choices like that. The committee members exchanged uneasy glances. The young fire chief cleared his throat. Maybe a statue isn't what this town needs, he said carefully. Maybe what we need is a memorial that honors everyone who suffered that night, not one man's legend. Applause began softly, then grew. Hesitant at first, then strong. Not unanimous, but strong enough. I stepped back from the podium, my knees weak but my heart lighter. For the first time in 40 years, the truth wasn't mine alone to carry. It had been spoken, heard, and set loose in the room like air after a long, suffocating night. My dears, justice doesn't always arrive with trumpets or parades. Sometimes it comes in the quiet collapse of a lie, in the steady courage of standing up at last. That night, I didn't just reclaim my story. I reclaimed myself. My dears, when the meeting ended and the room slowly emptied, I stayed seated for a long while. The statue boards still stood at the front, their glossy prints catching the light. But I knew now they would never be built. Bronze would not rise on my father's lie. For years I had lived like a ghost, carrying the truth as if it were a stone hidden under my shawl. That night, I laid it down. Not because it erased the pain, it never will, but because silence had cost me more than speaking ever could. Rebecca leaned against me as we walked out into the cool night. For the first time, her shoulders were not bowed with invisible weight. Mark walked beside us, quiet, but I noticed his fists were no longer clenched. Sometimes justice looks like a verdict in a courtroom. Ours came in the form of siblings who could finally breathe in the same air without choking on secrets. The town will take time. People will wrestle with what they heard. Some will cling to the comfort of the old myth. Others will carry forward the sharper, truer story. That is their journey. Mine, at 73 years old, is different. I returned to my small sewing room the next week. The fabric scraps waited where I had left them. My needles and threads gleamed in their jars. I took a piece of red cloth and cut it into a small heart for the doll I was finishing. As I stitched it on, I thought, every doll. I've ever made carries not just love, but survival. Every stitch is proof that the girl he left in the fire became a woman who lived, who told the truth, and who loved anyway. Rebecca comes to visit me now, more often than she ever did in those years of distance. We drink tea, and sometimes we cry. Other times we laugh about the little things. How Mother used to hum when she embroidered, how Mark tried to build a treehouse that collapsed in one day. Slowly, we are stitching ourselves back together. You see, my dears, survival isn't just about breathing through fire or flood. It's about choosing, again and again, not to let what was done to you define who you are. My father's choice marked me, but it does not own me. The truth set me free, even if it came late. Now I share it here with you because I believe stories, especially the painful ones, are not meant to be locked away. They are meant to remind us that strength can grow in the strangest soil, that justice can bloom even after decades of silence. If you've listened all this way, thank you. Truly. You've given this old grandmother the gift of being heard, maybe, for the first time in her life. Before you go, tell me in the comments where you are listening from, and what this story made you feel. Your words matter more than you know. And if stories of courage and hidden truths speak to your heart, I invite you to subscribe. We tell them carefully here, with dignity and honesty. Remember this, my dears. Sometimes the world will try to bury your truth under praise, under myths, under silence. Don't let it. The truth might shake foundations, but it also sets us free.